My name is Agnolo di Tura. They call me the Fat, a nickname from the streets of Siena, where I was born and where I have spent my entire life as a shoemaker, a tax collector, and a man of no great importance. I am not a poet. I am not a scholar. I am a man who worked with his hands and kept accounts and loved his family in the way that ordinary men do, quietly, without ceremony, assuming that love was something permanent. I am telling you this because I need you to understand who I was before the summer of 1348. I need you to understand what I had. I had a wife. Her name was Nicoluccia. She was of a higher station than me. She never let me forget it, though she said it with a smile that made forgetting irrelevant. We had 5 children. 5. They filled the house with noise and argument and laughter that I would give everything I have ever owned to hear again for one single minute. I am writing this down because someone has to. Because if no one writes it down, it is as if it never happened. And I cannot allow that. I cannot allow what happened here in Siena to disappear into silence as if we were nothing. We were not nothing. We were real people, and we suffered real things, and I will tell you exactly what I saw. The mortality began in Siena in May. It was a cruel and horrible thing, and I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty and the pitiless ways. It seemed to almost everyone that one became stupefied by seeing the pain. The human tongue cannot recount the awful truth. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. The victims died almost immediately. They would swell beneath their armpits and in their groins and fall over dead while talking. Father abandoned child, wife abandoned husband, one brother abandoned another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead, for money or for friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. The death bell did not sound. In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown into those ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. There were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world, and no medicine or any other defense availed. I want to stop here because I know those words. I buried my 5 children with my own hands. May sound to you like something from a story, something symbolic, something literary. It was not. I carried my first child to the pit on a Tuesday. His name was Marco. He was 6 years old. I carried my second 2 days later, then my third, then my 4th and my 5th within the same week, wrapped in what cloth I had left, because by then I had given most of my cloth to wrap the ones before them. Nicoluccia died between the 3rd and the 4th child. I buried her too. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I lived with it for the rest of my life, and the least I can ask is that you sit with it for a moment. 6 people. My entire family. Gone in the span of a few weeks, in a city that was itself dying all around me. And I was still standing. I did not know then, I do not know now, what to do with that. But I am not the only voice in this story. I need you to hear the others because what happened in 1348 was not a Sienese event or an Italian event. It was an event that swallowed the world whole, from east to west, and left almost no one untouched. So let me step back and let me tell you how it began. Because before Siena, before Florence, before any of the cities you know by name, there was a place called Caffa, on a coast you may never have heard of, and a decision made by a general who could not have imagined what he was unleashing. My name is Gabriele de Musi. I am a notary from Piacenza, which is in northern Italy, and I tell you that what I am about to describe is not rumor or invention. It is what I know to be true from the testimonies of those who were there, men I spoke to with my own ears, men who came off those ships from the east with the horror still printed on their faces. In the autumn of 1346, the Mongol forces of Jani Beg were besieging the city of Caffa on the Crimean coast. a Genoese trading outpost, the last Italian foothold in that part of the world. The siege had dragged on for months, and then the plague came to the Mongol camp, not as an ally, as an indiscriminate executioner. The Mongol troops began to die in thousands, swollen, blackened, screaming, or silent, depending on which form of the illness had found them. Jani Beg watched his army dissolve. He could not storm the walls, he could not hold the siege much longer, and so he made a decision that I struggle to describe without my hand trembling on the page. He ordered his men to load the bodies of the plague dead onto the war machines, the catapults, and hurl them over the walls of Kaffa, into the city, into the streets where the Genoese merchants and their families were living. He weaponized his own dead. The Genoese threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could. It was not fast enough. The illness took hold inside the walls. And when the Genoese finally fled, when the ships left the harbor of Kaffa in the spring of 1347, loaded with merchants desperate to return home to Italy, the plague came with them, invisible, patient, riding in the blood of fleas that lived in the fur of black rats that had come aboard for warmth and food, as rats always do. Those ships stopped in Constantinople. They stopped in Messina, in Sicily. They stopped in Genoa, in Venice. And at every port, the sailors who came ashore carried the death inside them like a letter they did not know they were delivering. Every city they touched became a city of the dying. Tell me, is there a cruelty greater than that? To kill people with a kindness, with an embrace at the dock, with the ordinary happiness of returning home. I think about those sailors sometimes. They did not know. Most of them were dead within weeks themselves. The guilty and the innocent were, in the end, indistinguishable, as they always are in a catastrophe of sufficient size. My name is Giovanni Boccaccio. I am a writer. Some would say a good one, others would disagree, and those others would be wrong, but I have never claimed to be a modest man. I was 35 years old in 1348 when the plague came to Florence. I was living in the finest city in all of Italy, a city of beauty and commerce and ambition, a city that believed in itself with a confidence that I had always found both inspiring and slightly ridiculous. Florence had cleared filth from its streets. Florence had banned infected persons from entering its gates. Florence had published instructions, distributed medical advice, organized processions of prayer. Florence had done, in other words, everything that Florence always did when confronted with a problem. It organized, it planned, it deployed the considerable intelligence of its considerable men, and none of it made any difference whatsoever. I watched Florence die. I watched it not in any metaphorical sense. I walked those streets. I breathed that air, which in the warmer months smelled of something I cannot fully describe to you, except to say that once you have smelled the air of a city where hundreds of people are dying every day, you never fully forget it. The symptoms were not subtle. They began with swellings in the groin or under the armpit, growing to the size of an apple, sometimes an egg, and then came the spots, black, purple, scattered across the arms and thighs and any exposed skin as if someone had pressed dark coins against the flesh. Most people who showed those marks were dead within 3 days. Some were dead within a day. Some fell down while walking and were dead before anyone reached them. What I want to tell you, what I feel obligated to tell you, as a writer who was given the responsibility of witnessing this, is that the plague did not just kill people. It dismantled everything that people had built around the idea of being people together. I watched a man refuse to enter his own house because his wife was sick inside it. I watched children sitting in doorways crying because no adult would approach them after their parents had died. I watched physicians, men who had sworn an oath, men of learning and training and genuine dedication, stop going to plague houses because they had watched too many of their colleagues die and decided, not unreasonably, that they would prefer to live. I understood every one of these decisions. I am not condemning anyone. When a catastrophe is large enough, the ordinary moral vocabulary simply fails. The words for what you should do in normal circumstances stop applying, and you are left with nothing but the raw animal question: survive or do not survive? And most people chose survive. I chose survive. I am not proud of everything I did or did not do in those months, but I am here, and I wrote it down, and perhaps that is worth something. The city organized itself in the only way it could. A special class of gravediggers appeared, men called the bacchini, recruited from the poorest beggars, men who had so little left to lose that the danger of handling plague bodies did not tip any particular scale for them. They charged enormous sums. They drank prodigiously. They were, in those months, probably the most powerful working men in Florence, because they held the only service that everyone, without exception, eventually required. I heard stories of bacchini who entered houses to collect the dead, and finding the residents too weak to resist, took what they wanted before collecting the body. I heard stories of bacchini who entered houses and simply sat down at the table and helped themselves to the food, because why not? The owner was going to die anyway. I am not sure I believe all of these stories. I am not sure I disbelieve them either. People become strange when death is close enough to breathe on them. I became strange. So did everyone I knew. What I remember most, though, and this is the thing I kept returning to as I began to write the book that would become my legacy, if I have one, is the silence. Florence before the plague was a city of noise. Markets, arguments, church bells, children, the sounds of commerce and construction and ordinary human friction. The Florence of that summer was a city where you could stand in a street that 6 months earlier had been impossible to cross for the crowd and hear nothing, just wind. And sometimes, from somewhere you could not quite locate, the low sound of a cart moving over cobblestones. The bacchini, making their rounds. My name is Jean de Venette, and I am a French Carmelite friar who saw what this plague did to France, to the people of my country, to the faith that I had built my life around. I tell you honestly, I am a man of God, and what I witnessed in 1348 and 1349 tested my faith in ways that I am still not entirely certain I survived intact. The plague came to us from Italy through Gascony and Spain, moving slowly at first, town to town, village to village, house to house, person to person, and then with a terrible acceleration, as if it had been gathering confidence. It reached Avignon, where the Pope resided, and killed several cardinals and took from them their entire households. Then it spread into France proper, and what happened then I can only describe as the progressive destruction of the world as I had always understood it. Here is what I need you to understand about the society in which I lived. Everything was connected to the church. Not as a metaphor, not as a political observation. Literally, structurally, in every practical sense. The church kept the records. The church organized the charities. The church maintained the hospitals. The church provided the framework by which people understood their lives, their deaths, their place in a universe that was otherwise incomprehensible. And when the plague killed priests faster than they could be replaced, because priests were, by definition, among those most exposed, since they entered the houses of the sick to deliver last rites and heard confession in rooms where the dying breathed their final infected breath. The entire architecture of daily spiritual life began to collapse. I watched congregations arrive at churches where the priest had died 2 days before. I watched families carry their dead to churchyards and find no one to receive them because the gravedigger was dead and his replacement was also dead. The Bishop of Bath and Wells in England, I heard this from reliable sources, sent out an order allowing lay people to confess their sins to each other, man to woman, if no priest could be found, because the alternative was dying without confession, which in our theology was a catastrophe more permanent than death itself. Think about what it means for a bishop to issue that order. Think about the depth of the crisis that produces it. And then came the other thing, the thing that I must speak of, even though it shames me to speak of it, because it happened among my own people, among Christians, among men and women who had been taught by the same faith that had taught me. The rumors began that the Jews had poisoned the wells. There was no evidence for this. There could be no evidence for this, because it was not true. Jewish communities were dying of plague at the same rates as Christian communities. The bacterium that killed you did not stop to inquire about your religion before deciding whether to continue. But fear is not interested in evidence. Fear is interested in having someone to blame. And the Jews were there, as they had always been there. Visible, identifiable, different, and therefore available. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive before the plague had even fully arrived in the city. In Mainz and in other towns along the Rhine, the massacres came one after another like a second plague moving alongside the first one. The Pope, Clement VI, issued condemnations from Avignon. He stated clearly and correctly that the Jews were suffering from the same pestilence as everyone else, that the charges were absurd, that the killings must stop. Most of his faithful ignored him. I am a man of the church, and I will tell you plainly, it was among the most profound moral failures I witnessed in my life, and I witnessed many. People who would have considered themselves good Christians, people who prayed and confessed and took communion, committed acts of mass murder against their neighbors because they were afraid and needed somewhere to put that fear. It solved nothing. The plague continued. God, if he was watching, gave no sign of having been appeased. And then there were the flagellants. I saw them pass through my city, hundreds of men, some of them traveling from as far as Germany and Flanders, bare-chested in the cold air of autumn, carrying leather straps embedded with iron spikes, beating themselves as they walked and as they prayed and as they bled through the streets. They had their own theology, their own conviction, that 33.5 days of this penance, the years of Christ's life, would earn divine protection from the plague. They stopped in town squares. They performed their rituals publicly, dramatically, inviting the crowds to witness and participate. Some of the people watching them joined. I watched a baker from my own parish strip off his tunic and walk away with the flagellants on a Thursday afternoon. I never saw him again. Whether the plague took him or the road took him, I cannot say. I hope, for his sake, that something helped. My name is Francesco Petrarch, and I am perhaps the most famous person whose voice you will hear today, which is its own kind of irony, because fame means nothing in a cemetery. I was in Avignon in April of 1348, where the papal court had resided for decades, when I received a letter informing me that Laura was dead. Laura, she whom I had loved from a distance since I first saw her in church on the 6th of April 1327, she who had lived in my poems with a vividness that exceeded anything in my daily life, she who had never been mine in any conventional sense, and yet whom I had arranged my entire emotional existence around, dead, of plague, in the same city where I was sitting, while I was still alive. I have written about loss my entire life. I built a career, and some would say a civilization, on the literary examination of longing and grief and the transience of human beauty. And then the plague came and showed me that I had understood exactly nothing. The words I had for grief, the formal, elegant, carefully constructed words of the literary tradition, collapsed instantly under the weight of real grief, the grief of an actual world where actual people were dying by the tens of thousands, and there was nothing poetic about any of it. The streets of Avignon were full of the dead. The papal palace was burning fires around its perimeter because the physicians had advised the Pope that fires would purify the corrupted air. Clement VI sat between two enormous bonfires for months, even in the summer heat, because that was the best medical advice available to the most powerful man in Western Christendom. Think about that for a moment. The most advanced medicine in the world in 1348 was sit between two fires. I have asked myself many times whether I deserved to survive. It is a question that has no answer, but that the mind asks anyway in the dark, when there is nothing else to occupy it. Why me and not Laura? Why me and not the friends I lost? And I lost so many that I stopped counting at a certain point, not because I stopped caring, but because the mind protects itself by going numb when the counting becomes unbearable. When has any such thing been even heard or seen? In what annals has it ever been read that houses were left vacant, cities deserted, the country neglected, the fields too small for the dead, and a fearful and universal solitude over the whole earth? Happy are those who were not born into these times, and happy are those who died before, and so did not know such things. We who remain, we are strangers walking through a world that has been emptied of most of what made it familiar. I kept writing. What else does a writer do? I kept writing because writing was the only tool I had, the only thing that gave me any sense of agency against events that were entirely beyond my control or understanding. I wrote letters, I wrote poems, I wrote to friends who were, by the time the letters arrived, frequently dead. I wrote about Laura in a way that mixed the artificial grief of my earlier poetry with something rawer and truer and less beautiful, because real grief is not beautiful, regardless of what the poets tell you. Real grief is a shoemaker in Siena, digging a hole in the ground and lowering his children into it one by one. Real grief is a friar watching his congregation disappear week by week until the church is empty. Real grief is not a metaphor. It is a specific weight, in a specific body, on a specific morning, when the world has become unrecognizable and you must somehow continue to move through it anyway. Back in Siena, I, Agnolo di Tura, the shoemaker, want to tell you what happened after. Because I know that in stories like this, the ending is usually the catastrophe and then silence. But there was an after. There was a morning eventually when the carts came less often, when the pits were filled and no new ones were being dug, when the bells, which had stopped ringing for the dead because there were too many dead to ring for, began to ring again for other reasons. The plague did not leave because it was defeated. It left because it had taken what it wanted and moved on, east, north, into other cities, other bodies. What it left behind in Siena was a city that had held more than 30,000 men and now held fewer than 10,000, and those 10,000 were, as I wrote in my chronicle, like persons distraught and almost without feeling. The cathedral, the great project that had been the pride of Siena for decades, the building that was supposed to be the most magnificent church in all of Christendom, stood abandoned, half finished. The nave open to the sky. The workers were dead. The architects were dead. The patrons were dead. The ambition that had driven it felt, to those of us who remained, like something that belonged to a different world entirely. A world of people who believed that their projects would be completed, that the future was a place they were building toward. That faith was one of the casualties of 1348, and I am not certain it ever fully recovered. And then, and I include this because I believe you need to know it, because it is perhaps the strangest thing of all, life continued. After the great pestilence of the past year, each person lived according to his own caprice. Everyone tended to seek pleasure in eating and drinking, in hunting, in catching birds, in gaming. The disciplines of ordinary existence had been revealed as optional, which is what happens when you watch half your world die, and no one who was careful and righteous was saved any more than anyone who was careless and wicked. The plague made no moral distinctions. It took the pious and the sinful with equal indifference. And so the survivors, who had spent months in absolute terror, did what survivors do. They ate, they drank, they made noise again. They filled the silence with the sounds of living, because the silence had been too close to the sound of death, and they could not stand it for another day. I remarried. The fact of this still surprises me when I think about it. That there was a day after Nicoluccia's death when I got up and did something other than grieve, that there was eventually a year in which I saw a woman and thought something other than loss. I do not know if this speaks well of me or badly of me. I think it speaks of the human animal, which is better at continuing than at stopping. We continue. Even when we should perhaps stop and fully reckon with what has happened, we continue. We build new things where the old things stood. We grow food in the fields where the bodies were buried. We quarrel with our neighbors about property lines and inheritances. We are, in the end, stubbornly, persistently, sometimes infuriatingly alive. The Black Death did not end when it left Siena. It came back. It came back in waves for the next 300 years, to London, to Marseille, to cities across the continent. Each time smaller than the last, each time leaving behind a world that was slightly different from the one before. The survivors of 1348 found that their labor was suddenly valuable in a way it had never been before, because there were not enough people left to work the land, and a peasant who can walk away and find employment elsewhere is a peasant with power. The rigid hierarchies of medieval feudalism began, slowly and painfully, to crack. Not because of any revolution, not because of any act of courage or vision, but because of mathematics. Because when you kill a third of the people, the survivors have leverage they never had before, and leverage eventually changes everything. We did not know this at the time. At the time, we were simply trying to get through the day. We were trying to bury our dead and keep our children fed and make sense of a world that had demonstrated, with casual brutality, that it owed us no sense whatsoever. We prayed. Some of us stopped praying. Some of us prayed harder than we ever had, and then stopped entirely when the praying produced nothing. We quarreled about what had caused it: the stars, the air, the Jews, the sins of mankind, the will of God, the corruption of the earth. We were wrong about almost all of it. The actual cause, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on black rats, spreading through blood and breath in the narrow streets of medieval cities, would not be understood for another 500 years. If I could speak to you across that distance, and in some strange way, since you are reading this, I suppose I can, I would want to tell you only this: we were real. The numbers are real too, and they are staggering, and they should stagger you. 50 million dead, perhaps more, a third to half of everyone alive in Europe, gone in less than a decade. But behind those numbers were people who woke up every morning and made breakfast and argued with their children and worried about money and loved people imperfectly and tried to be a little better than they were the day before. We were not different from you in any way that matters. We did not know, when we got up on the mornings before the plague arrived, that this was the last ordinary day. We never do. Nobody ever does.
These boots are still wet.
I am Agnolo di Tura, shoemaker of Siena, and I want you to remember my children's names: Marco, and the others whose names I will carry with me until my own death, which I will face having written this down, having made sure that someone would know. This is what we do for each other across time. We write it down so that the ones who come after know that we were here, that we were afraid, that we buried our dead with our own hands, and then, because there was nothing else to do, we stood up and continued. This is what survival looks like. Not triumph, not healing exactly, not the clean resolution of a story that has been built to satisfy you. Just this: a man at a rough wooden table, a candle burning low, a city quieter than it should be, writing down what he saw, so that you would know, so that they would not disappear completely into the silence that had already taken so much. You have heard their voices now. The question is what you do with them. If you were in Florence in the spring of 1348, knowing only what they knew, would you have fled to the countryside and left everyone behind? Would you have stayed and helped your neighbors, knowing that helping might kill you? Or would you have poured yourself a drink and decided that fate had already written the ending? Leave your answer in the comments. We want to hear it. Every voice that responds is another small act against forgetting. Like the video, if these stories reached you, it tells the world that the people who filled those pits in 1348 are still worth remembering. We will see you next time on The Time Machine.